Hello? Good. Welcome to the third of three lunchtime plenary talks on the region and the city of New Orleans, and the region and the state, and generally the socio-political environmental setting. But before I go ahead, there's one reminder or a little note you may not have picked up, but the address on your ticket, if you're going to the aquarium tonight, the address on your ticket is incorrect. Small detail. But there's really only one aquarium, so I didn't think too many people would be put off. But just in case, it's at one Canal place, which is at the very foot of the ferry almost, only a little bit further downstream. So the aquarium is located at 1 Canal Street if you're using your GPS on your iPhone. And it's just past the Hilton Hotel, which adjoins this. It's about 3/4 north from here, which actually is downstream from here. So don't go the way your northern tendencies might tell you to go. Go downstream. That's the real metric. And you can walk there. It's just, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. And you could, of course, take a taxi. But there are no horse and buggies. So just to introduce Shirley Laska, Dr. Laska is the founding director of the Center for Hazard Assessment and Response and Technology at the University of New Orleans, which was many, I won't say how many years ago, but a while ago, way before people thought it was a good idea probably, except for there. And now the words I used were assessment and technology, and et cetera. She's a sociologist. She's a social scientist. So this is really a leap off the precipice. And yes, a net did form, and it was a really prescient thought and development that she carried off, which are several different items to go in sequence. And she's been vice president of, or vice chancellor of research at the University of UNO, and she's well, she's a friend. She's a friend to everybody that wants to be a better public servant with the science that we're trying to do. And she's also a mentor and a colleague, which is what she's going to talk about. And she worked on this book, which is about the catastrophe of Katrina, which was, well, she'll describe it and some with more context. But I want to read you off the back jacket what it says about it, just to put her on the spot. This masterpiece of scholarship breaks through a clutter of explanations of Hurricane Katrina. Now that would be a pretty good thing for anybody have had to adapt it to their work. And the colleagues have ground their analysis in an enduring sociological concept to advance their argument of humans biting nature. And I want you to invite Shirley Laska to talk about this, and there'll be time for questions, and there's 4 microphones set up, and I hope we'll have some discussion when she concludes her initial foray into this subject matter.
Well, thank you very much for taking your lunchtime and not finding yourself in a restaurant that would require a couple of hours of eating and imbibing before you came back to your sessions. I started my college career as a student lab assistant in the herpetology collection at Harvard while I was a social science major at Boston University, never realizing the impact that was going to have on my future professional career. But it enabled me to start a collaborative and start a relationship kind of pathway with the biophysical sciences that has been just a wonderful experience for me, and I would wish that there were many, many more social scientists who would be able to do or had thought about having this kind of collaboration, and also many more of you who would likewise be interested in such. And I suspect some of you in the audience are just that because you were interested in a social science topic. My last teaching, I'm an emerita professor now, but you know, we never stop working, was with Shea Penland, who is a coastal geologist, was a coastal geologist, And our course was entitled The Geology and Sociology of Coastal Louisiana. And it was a course that no other course gave us more pleasure and satisfaction with what we were able to impart to students than that collaborative course. So I encourage you all to think about those kinds of courses in your own universities. Okay, I'm going to talk with you today about work that was done after Katrina. And I call it the engineering of Katrina, but I'd like to add that term, social engineering, and you'll see what I mean when I get into the theme. My three co-authors are Bill Freudenberg, Bob Gramling, and Kai Erickson. Bill was at UC Santa Barbara and has been deceased for 2 years, sadly died at too young an age, and some of you may know his work, a strident advocate for the issues that I'm going to raise. His co-collaborator, they were attached at the hip. You never knew which one was writing what on their work, is Bob Gramling, who's at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And he too is quote unquote retired, but just finishing up yet another book. And Kai Erickson is the well-known Kai Erickson from Yale, who did a book called Everything in Its Path about the impact of mining in West Virginia many decades ago. And some of you, if some of you have taken social sciences, especially environmental social science, you will have read his book as one of the most important. So it was a joy to work with these friends with whom we'd been collaborating for a couple of decades. Now, one would start perhaps with a conversation and ask about coastal Louisiana, is it indeed a risky place? And there's no doubt that we would say yes, but we would likely say so because of these dramatic, quick happening events that disrupt us incredibly, harm us incredibly, and then go away, and then we have to pick up in the aftermath. And you can see from this slide how many of those storms we have had since 2005. They simply never seem now to stop coming. And they also like to head for the Delta and for our lives. But what we're going to say today, or what I'm going to discuss with you, and I want to see this as a conversation. Hopefully we'll have time at the end to have some questions. Right now I can't see a single one of you with these lights, but we're going to turn the lights up and be able to interact. And our proposition of this book is that normal actions lead to disasters and catastrophes, not the quick event such as a storm. And that contrary to the usual assumptions that a disaster is caused by a sudden disruption, it is in fact our normal everyday actions that lead to them. Now, if that proposition is correct, then the conclusion that we would come to is what humans do to nature, it is what humans do to nature that leads to the disaster rather than what nature does to us. So I'm going to look at two areas of use of this part of the country, some macro areas, and we're going to use those as examples. The book's area is navigation, but I'm also going to talk to you about habitation, the living here. And I'm going to discuss this topic utilizing some concepts. The first and most important one is the concept of the growth machine. I'm also going to talk with you about the concept of obsolescence on delivery. And then thirdly, also ask, where is the resistance to projects that produce these catastrophes? Who of you are those who are resistors? Who of the social scientists, the policymakers? Where are we? Why aren't there more of us? And I'm going to end with a brief conversation about the California Delta and the tri-state area that just was impacted by Sandy, because unfortunately it's likely that the same things will happen there as happened here with regard to man's impact on nature. And then I'll ask finally, what should we be doing to mitigate these challenges? So we have four prime uses here on the Delta. Oil and gas production, of course, is one of our prime uses. If you've never seen this map before, it's a little bit of a breathtaking inhale kind of thing. Those are all the rigs, pipelines, and the green on your right-hand side is the oil spill of the BP Macondo. We also, of course, have human habitation, and it's been an amazing area to live because one work of Larry Powell at Tulane, a new book he's recently come out with, I highly recommend, called The Accidental City. As you know, we probably never ever should have been here, and it was politics that put us, but then of course the location became useful to the other functions, and here we sit, you know, stuck in the mud, sinking, losing our land, being impacted, and still hanging on for, you know, for dear life. Thirdly, of course, the fisheries. Because of the ecosystem, we have amazing fisheries, and some of my long-term work has been in that area, first with shrimpers and now with the ecosystem harvesters in the Barataria Bay, which is going to be our primary area of restoration. And then fourthly, transportation/navigation, and this one trumps the others. I would say that because of the new discoveries and the new technology to explore the Gulf, that perhaps oil and gas is the preeminent one, but navigation has always trumped habitation. And therefore, that leads to policy decisions that have been quite unfortunate sometimes for the habitation and for the fisheries. So we'll look at these two, the navigation and the human habitation. Now, it's in the social sciences, especially when you do what's called qualitative research, where your responsibility is to seek observations, be they in data that you find in secondary sources or simply participating. It's the ahas that sometimes really gives you an insight as to what is going on. I'm going to start my talk with one aha, and I'm going to end with another. And both of them, in my opinion, really give us a serious clue as to why we have had these catastrophes happen here. May 2005, a young hydrologist, coastal hydrologist, whose name is Mashriqi Hassan, who is currently in Maryland working for the, so I have it here, the Hydrology Science and Modeling Program of the National Weather Service, was here in Louisiana at LSU, and the date May 2005 is the important point of this story because he made a presentation on that date to all of the presidents of the coastal parishes. We call our counties parishes here from our history of being connected to the French culture. And he presented data which he said he had seen and had observed from a hypothetical hurricane model called Hurricane Pam, which had been described in July 2004. And what he had seen, and these are his slides, was look at the flow of the pattern of the surge into the area. I have to use this to show it to you here. So this is what we're looking at here. And it might not be coming out too well on yours, but there's actually all these little white lines showing the flow into this area. And these are his slides of that day, putting it into layperson's terms, not giving it to the people in attendance in highly technical terms. He basically told the group, and it was a pretty large group, that there was indeed in his mind a funnel that was right there, very visible. And that funnel was like he likened to the Trojan horse, just waiting for the enemy to, to come out of it. And these are the terms, as I say, the words that he used. And you can see that up here, the ways in which the area would flood. Here's after the funnel, the area that as you go in, and that would be in this area here. And then this is where the actual surge would come and try to squeeze into this pathway. And he also talked about what had happened in 1965. Well, the aha of that meeting, and probably the most of the people there didn't see it as an aha, was that when he sat down, there was total silence. Not a single question was asked. And by the way, the Corps of Engineers was also present. And I thought, isn't this interesting? We have just been told the means by which we are going to have a catastrophe that might be beyond belief, and no one has a question. Well, I hope at the end of my talk you'll understand why there was silence, or at least one interpretation of it, which we can talk about. So now that I've gotten you to May 2005, I'm going to take you back and do a little bit of history of the canals. I won't do too much because I understand Rich Campanella did a wonderful job presenting that, and also the speakers on Tuesday as well. But we are a city that has had a history of the economic development being focused on the ways in which transportation, again navigation, would bring goods in and out of the city. And prior to the Mississippi River Gulf outlet being constructed, it was completed in 1968, we had 4 major canals that were constructed. So we see that the first one was Bayou St. John, became the Carondelet Canal, and came right down into the French Quarter. Then we had the New Basin Canal, which was built later on by Irish immigrants, coming down to this location. This is where we piled all the millions of tons of debris from Katrina along this canal, which is now just a wide green open area. And we also had the Lake Bourne Canal, which is not on this map, which goes down here and out into the Lake Bourne into the east. And then here is the Industrial Canal, the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, and its purposes, as you'll see, were principally for economic development. Now, just to show you how with each canal there was a change in what was carried, what was transported, you'll notice, and I'm sorry this is so dark, it was a PDF and I could not make it lighter. I'm just asking you to compare that this was the original canal, this is the more recent one, and you can see this shift in product as those 2 canals, as this one diminished in importance and as this one grew. So obviously the larger canal, the New Basin, was able to carry lumber more readily, and it was also in a time when the city was growing and it had a different function, a different purpose. But this is the normal economic development that happens in every community. The community you live in, you could follow its history in the same fashion. Then comes along the Industrial Canal, or the Inner Harbor, and this slide is particularly important for me to point out mainly these 2 here. The width was 75 feet and the sill was 31.5. That's the one that you'll have to remember as we go forward. Now, this is the imagining of what this canal could produce economically for the city. And there was lots of push to have this canal created because all those different locales would be a berth for some kind of waterborne activity. And you can see how excited the community was because they imagined that all those sites could be utilized. Now, on this map, I want to point out to you right here the Gulf outlet, because this was just constructed before the Industrial Canal, and it's our part of the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, which goes from Texas all the way across Louisiana, out in the open water across Mississippi and Alabama, and then through Florida to the East Coast Intracoastal. And it's where barges transport materials. So they knew they had the Intracoastal Waterway here when they were building this, and it was completed in 1923. So then we come to the topic of today's discussion, which we call Mr. Go. You can also call it MRGO. We never do the whole thing. It's just too much of a mouthful. And it was conceived and talked about as early as 1927. And of course, as good detailed people, my colleagues Bill Freudenberg and Bob Gramling traced it back and have all the quotes from this. But one of them that's the most important is the one you'll see, 1943, and it's very sociological, as you can see. It basically says we can't be subject to that gross river. You know, it smelled, it was windy, it had insects, it had alligators, and it had always been seen that way, and that's why I encourage you to pick up a copy of Larry's book on the accidental city, because he does a great job in describing it. It's a Harvard University book. But this representation, this framing, as we would say in sociology, was really a way to say we want something modern. We want it to be a straight shot to the Gulf, none of this wiggly, none of these problems. And thus begins the saga of the growth machine advocating for the creation of Mr. Go. Now, I can't go into all the details, and that, again, are in the book and several articles we've done if you'd like any resources to get to them. But here's just the specifics. There was lots of local support, which the Corps calls regional economic development support. There was also national support for it. They argued that national security, because you wouldn't want to have that industrial canal lock prevent military ships from going in and out of New Orleans. Also, there was a concern that Canada and the St. Lawrence at that time would take the transportation from the Midwest, so we wanted to retain that transportation in the U.S. And the other thing that happened was that the growth machine, the local economic advocates, found a way and knew how to manage the interest of the local community, the state community, and the federal government. Today we would call this pork, okay? And I guess they probably had a similar word for it at the time. And they also were able to create a benefit-cost ratio for this project that was low because they failed to include the maintenance cost within it. So while you just saw the advocacy for this locale, you'll see how the resistance came to be. And this is what one researcher has said about the benefit-cost ratio as a way to argue for a project, an environmental project. The cost-benefit exercise is usually a drunkard's search for data to support a given course of action. The frequency of benefit-cost ratios over 1, you have to achieve 1 for the government to fund these projects, would surprise no one. Data, once pliable, become hardened through handling, meaning that something you might speculate might be true eventually becomes the truth. And so you go forward arguing the case for this. So the momentum built. It took a long time to build. The quote you saw was in the 40s, and it wasn't completed until 1968, and that becomes an issue. So then we ask, well, where was the opposition? Where was the Mashriqui Hassan of that particular period? And yes, indeed, there were. Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries was extremely concerned. The U.S. Department of the Interior was. The St. Bernard newspaper, St. Bernard is the county in which Mr. Go is constructed, was very fearful. The southern part of below New Orleans was just starting to bud as a suburb. The area by the airport where you all came in was already fully starting to be built out. They were very afraid people would not wait for bridges to be crossed in order to do this, and were resistant. And even the county council opposed it. But it was to no avail because the momentum of the growth machine was so strong. So in 1960, as the canal was, as the channel, was being dug, look at the huge amount of marshland that had to be moved initially, and then I'll have slides to show you what was lost after it. 272 million cubic yards had to be dug up in order for this channel to be produced. So here's the growth machine concept that I have referred to. Its creator is a professor, a sociologist, who spent much of his time at UC Santa Barbara and was there when the Santa Barbara oil spill happened and became very interested in the growth machine and environmental impacts, and is currently a senior endowed chair professor at NYU. And let me just sort of reiterate what the explanation is of the growth machine. It's a process that is built and set in motion by persons who focus on profit and progress. But it is a process that has no internal brakes and no sensors to take note of the damage it may do as it churns along. Those are the key aspects of it. It's not that it's bad because it focuses on profit and progress, but it doesn't have any sensors, any ways of asking what impact on the environment today or tomorrow or a decade or two from now is what we're doing today going to have. So the goals aren't bad. And the public often supports it. You like economic development in your community. But the problem is the forceful way the goals are pursued ignore long-term consequences. So we're going to look just at the destructive process and the benefits. We'll take the benefits first, and you'll see that there's very, very few. Now, the draft of the canal was 36 feet. For a period of time, that was an adequate draft for the ships that were being produced. But shortly after its completion, the size of the ships that were built worldwide were larger than that draft would accommodate. And the problem with the growth machine is once you get an idea into a political process and it takes so long to accomplish, nobody on the way to accomplishing it says, now wait a minute, maybe what we want to have constructed is already obsolete before it will be done. That question was not asked. Blindfolders were on. So Mr. Go did not serve the economic purposes that they had anticipated because the technology was outdated before it actually was completed. So this diagram, this table, simply shows you how little it was used. If you take the first year, 1995, of all the head of passes tonnage that passed through the navigation system here, only 1.74% ever used the outlet. All the rest of it used the river. And in 2004, a year before Katrina, it had gone down to 0.39. Another way of understanding it is to look at this diagram, this table, where the draft of the ships from 29 feet and higher, the ship could not go through the industrial canal lock from the river. It had to use Mr. Go. And at 36 and greater, it could not. So there were only a dozen ships that went up and back in the year 2004, a dozen, okay? Now, this is the kind of ship that could get through the industrial canal, but this company, it will become the final aha of my talk, is right in the industrial canal, and it's the Frozen Chicken Warehouse. Real sexy name, Frozen Chicken Warehouse, okay? And this is the boat that was used after Katrina to be able to go in, drop off the chickens or pick up the chickens. I guess you bring them down from the Midwest, you leave them there, and then the ships come and take them to the world. This company, after Katrina, wanted to go back to using the large ships that it had used previously. Okay. Now, this kind of ship never could make it into the Mr. Go because the draft was too big, too deep. The measurements on the front of the bow are meters, so you can see how deep it goes. And so you had the challenge of not being able to use it. So here's the final stats on this. Only 13 ships needed to get to the industrial canal with a draft of 29 to 36 feet in 2004. $19.1 million was spent to dredge that year, okay? So with 12 round trips, you have a $1.5 million charge for each ship that used the Mississippi River Gulf outlet that year. So after Katrina, the Corps decided that maybe there was a problem here we had to address, and they came to the conclusion that it was not cost effective to continue dredging it. But after Katrina, they were poised to go back doing it. They were ready, okay? Also, they did another tally. $580 million had been spent, okay, on the maintenance of it since 1958. $558 million, $500 million. And they came to the conclusion that perhaps we needed to stop this, and they had the plan to put a closure down far on the Mr. Go to at least stop the salinity from coming in. As you'll see, the salinity is what really was that made the damage. So between 1956 and 1990, 68,000 acres of wetlands were lost in this study area. The way it's lost is when the ships go through it, the wake causes the mud to fall away from the sides. It also is a straight shot to bring salinity. It raises the salinity regime in the area, and it kills all the plants that require more fresh water. So on the top map, see the date, 1953. This is what the area looked like. It was healthy marsh. In fact, it wasn't just marsh, it was swamp. It had stands of cypress trees. And then after 1980, all that was gone, and it was now open water. I don't need to say these words to you. When I've made parts of this presentation to others, we want to explain why swamps are important for storm surges. They slow the water, they break up the waves, they block the wind, and I know you could say that to me back in much more technical terms, but we all understand that there's a benefit of having swamps over open water for the movement of surges. This is what it looks like today in that area. And closer up to the city, there isn't even the dead trees. We call these ghost forests. And this gives you also a sense of, this is the open water here. This is the lower Ninth Ward. This is St. Bernard. This is the triangle that they're now trying very hard to restore using the tertiary treated sewage from the sewage and treatment plant that's here. And this area is just open. When you drive this highway on both sides, it's just all open water now. Now this was the event that you heard all around the world. This is the overtopping and then the breaking of the industrial canal levee, flood wall, excuse me, into the lower Ninth Ward. My colleagues, Bill and Bob and myself, were able to go in quite early through St. Bernard, and these are the photographs that we took. I mean, it's just stunning, just unbelievable. This is the barge right up here, I believe. They're just starting. 5 full blocks completely wiped off the face of the lower Ninth and deposited into the rest of the neighborhood. And this was the deposition. Notice how high the water went for the appliances to be on the roof. So now we have, I call it a barrier across Mashriqui's funnel. 2006, I believe, it took 3 years to have this barrier built. If you've ever worked with the Corps, you know that usually Corps work takes decades. It was the largest design and build contract that they had ever given, and it was done in a flash. Now this is what Mashriqui said was going to happen. Here is it right here, see? This is the barrier, and this is Mashriqui's funnel. Sort of stunning, isn't it? Makes you pause. And it also makes you think about the role of scientists, doesn't it? If someone had heard, if they could have heard Mashriqui. Mashriqui is from Bangladesh. And he said in interviews that we conducted with him afterwards, he said, I know what it means when people die in storm surges, and I didn't want it to happen to my new country and my new locale. So here's the report, the deauthorization study. Really resisted. Even the parish, St. Bernard, didn't want the barrier to be put up in the lower part of the canal. Finally, after too many meetings in which people got up and reminded the parish president how many people had died, he finally changed his mind and agreed to the closure. So here's the map that goes with the closure. And the first closure was one down here, and this was a rock jetty. And that did stop the salinity from moving up, because it was the salinity that killed all of this, okay? And now the discussion goes on of the other kinds of things that are going to have to be done to mitigate the problems that the event caused. This one's the most controversial because the residents of the parish don't want to have a canal in their midst. They have been through way too much in terms of what happened when they let a canal happen. So they are resisting, and the public is very much resisting. But even the other plans are fraught with problems because some of these, they want to take soil out of the Lake Bourne, use Lake Bourne as the spoil bank to add to to building these areas. And there's a concern that there might be some hydrologic issues if you create a deeper hole over which the water the surges might flow. And that's still being discussed. And again, many of you would know better than I whether there is any concern, but it's been expressed. So the two lessons that we take from this example are that technologically we have reached the point where the dimensions of our projects can do enormous environmental damage. I want to sort of be funny and go, we finally have figured that out, you know. But the second point is that because of the massive size of these economic development projects, even if we come to understand that it was a mistake, it may be impossible to undo. Now here's the statistic that's stunning. MRGO will never be filled in, ever. You got to put the barrier up, but you know what the barrier means. The barrier means that you have controlled wetlands behind it. It's funny how we've been debating barriers, flood walls, and levees throughout our coast, and the environmentalists, myself included, are very sensitive to concerns about controlled wetlands behind barriers. Wasn't even a discussion of it when this came out. They just slapped that barrier on like that because they realized how serious the impact had been on the area. But the actual area that was excavated, all those tons and tons, or cubic yards, excuse me, of soil, will never be filled in. 15 to 44 years and $2.8 billion, it will never come to pass. So that hole, that wound in the ecosystem will always be there. Okay, now, this is my second aha. Remember the frozen chicken warehouse? Okay. So we went through 3 major planning processes after Katrina in order to get ourselves a plan that would enable the money to be released to us to repair ourselves. Just like they're going through in the tri-state area. I'm not following that in detail because after 7 years, we're still completing our research and still writing up and publishing the research that we've been doing. But we had, the way they did it at the end is they had citywide goals, priorities, and then they had neighborhood priorities. And in the top three priorities of what money should be spent for to recover from Katrina, moving the frozen chicken warehouse out of the industrial canal was in those top 3. That's the power of a growth machine. It started in the 40s and still had the political clout to be worried about the frozen chicken plant. And here's the data. Now, if you go on the web, I just shared this data with a colleague in January, a Tulane professor. Went on it a couple days ago to prepare this talk, and it is no longer on the web. So I have no idea why it has been pulled off, but no one can find it. But fortunately, my colleague at Tulane had taken a screenshot of it. And here's the screenshot. So, whoops, sorry. This frozen chicken factory warehouse is right here. And this column says must do, highest priority. So there's that momentum that makes it so difficult to stop and ask the question, is this harming the environment? Will it harm the environment in the future? Is it worth it in terms of the harm versus the outcome? So this is the iconic photograph that was taken by a friend of ours who's a photographer of the ghost forest and the city beyond it. So now I'm going to turn to the human habitation and spend my next 10 or 15 minutes on telling you the same story but in a different way, with different examples. We're going to look at New Orleans East, we're going to look at the Bowl, and then we're going to ask about the California Delta and the tri-state area. So taking the same map that you saw before, I'm simply putting in a box the area that I will be discussing. New Orleans East goes on Highway 90 to Mississippi. When I came to graduate school at Tulane many decades ago, that was the only road in, was Highway 90, and we came in, and I was a bit stunned by the heat and the mosquitoes and all the things that I was about to encounter for the rest of my life, but we came right in on this area. Now, those of you who are local or have studied it know that it's just as low and flat and swampy as it can possibly be. So in 1961, they investigated again whether this area should be developed, just like with Mr. Go. You know, should Mr. Go be developed? And this is what the engineers said. It sounds just like the opposite of the commentary that was made about the stinky, winding Mississippi River. The area is a sink, the greater portion of which is some 7 feet below mean lake level. The vast majority of the developable area of the tract averages an elevation of 14.3, but it's uninhabitable and has been so since the advent of the white man. So this is a business. This was an engineering business, not someone who wanted to have a negative outcome of their analysis. So with this kind of opposition, we had others quoted. Here's another one that I thought was particularly edgy, humorous. Apply insanity, divide the raw cost by 2, and it's still ridiculous. So there was really opposition to developing this area. And this work is being done by my colleague, Vern Baxter, a Madison PhD, who has looked into just how did it come that we developed this area? What was the growth machine hubris that led to this? So there's an aerial view of it, and you can see how much water you can see all in this area. You can see how low it is. And I want you to note that this is the I-10 coming in now. Highway 90 is down here. Right here, you notice these little exits you can see from the sky. Those were put in because of business dealings of friends of Lady Bird Johnson when her husband was the president, because there was intent to not only develop this, which was bad enough, but they were also going to develop even the swampier part of the area. And the they is what I'll say in a second. Right now we have 35,000 residential structures in this area, an area that the engineers in 1961 said, don't do it. Okay? Now, how did it come to be? The same growth machine dynamics has happened with Mr. Go. Too rapid a development process, reluctance by the government to provide the necessary drainage. They didn't want to spend the money, they weren't excited about it, they didn't have, the resources to do it, but the developers, the growth machine was pushing. Extreme subsidence. I've had friends who have houses out there, and in the course of their owning them, there's been 5 feet of loss of their front yard. 5 feet. I mean, that's just unthinkable. And they were built slab houses with inadequate fill, okay? So this is what it looks like after Katrina. This is an area that became a predominantly African American and also predominantly upper income African American. So this was the dream, the American dream of our African American population to own a suburban house. And their dream was lost with Katrina because the growth machine was successful in creating homes that would put them at risk. So here is what the tools were. The wetlands, I'm quoting Vern now, Baxter. The wetlands were brought into commerce via a process of real estate speculation enhanced by federal programs that required speedy flipping of developable land. So there was federal legislation passed that would give these developers tax credits if they bought the land, developed it, and flipped it really fast. And that's how they made their profit. It was done by some local developers, but principally by a New York corporate real estate magnate. He was the only, his company was the first corporation, real estate corporation, that was created in the United States. And as I said, Lady Bird Johnson's business partners were also part of it. And that's just trivia. That doesn't have any particular reason for saying it, except it's interesting that the political forces were there to encourage it. So we have in New Orleans East, if you have a chance to go out there, it'll not make your time here. It's very sad to see all these homes, people trying to come back, trying to make their yards decent, trying to put enough fill in. They just broke ground for a hospital. It's been 7.5 years and there's been no hospital out there. Shopping center is gone. There's a couple big boxes, 1 or 2 grocery stores, and it was a thriving suburban middle-class African-American community beforehand. Okay, so let's finish up with the New Orleans story by looking at the bowl. The bowl is the middle part of the city. You can see how I've marked it. You can see from this map also where the breaches were of the canals that come into it. And historically, here's what it looked like. So we're sitting down here. Oh, sorry, excuse me. It's down in this area here, okay? This was where the original city here, and I live in Carrollton, which is part of the city, but it's right here. And all of this was uninhabited in 1849. Come 1930s, somebody got the idea that it would be super to develop the bowl. And how do you develop the bowl? You put an attractive, expensive strip of neighborhoods on the rim of the bowl. And this is Lake Vista, which is the most expensive of the rim subdivisions, but there's 5 of them out at Lake Pontchartrain. You see how lovely it is. There's no roadways that go through it. You can bicycle and walk and had all the amenities of the Greenbelt concept that you have in Greenbelt, Maryland and in Ohio. So here is the bowl, okay? Now, look at who was the growth machine in the bowl. The levee board. That's not an aha. Provided grass cutting, provided lighting, provided that we had levee board police before Katrina. Every amenity you'd want for the growth, but not a lot of time spent on the levees. We also, from the turn of the 20th century, have developed one of the best pumping systems in the country. The wood pump, which is a very basic screw pump that's utilized in most of the pumping stations, and you can see how many we have to keep all this going. But this is the outcome. This is the impact on the ecosystem. Here we sit, where we are right here. Here's that Lake Vista neighborhood. All this land was mud pumped in from the river. And here sits the bowl. And this is the Metairie Ridge in the middle, which you saw in the original historic map. Now, some of this, of course, is natural. But other of it isn't. This is the line of what the bowl looked like in 1895. And this is the line of what the bowl looks like today. And this is the success of those pumps. Okay? Oops. Now this is a new map that's been created by a group of architects and engineers. David Wagoner has been leading, and I'll speak more in detail about it in a moment. But all this is enhanced vertical exaggeration of LiDAR data with the polders filled to the sea level. So in New Orleans, all this area is below sea level, except for the white areas, which again are enhanced. And this is our Lake Vista neighborhood right out here. And we're sitting, let me get it straight here. We're sitting about, I'm sorry, I'm blanking, I think about in this area here. So this is how much success we've had in having those pumps. Drain the marsh, drain the peat, pull it down, way down. What areas flooded the worst? All these areas. You can see here's New Orleans East, here's St. Bernard, here's the bowl behind what you would know is like Tulane University in that area, and this is behind the French Quarter. And this did not flood because this levee did not break on this side and this stayed dry, but there's always another storm. So here's the group that's been doing something called Living with Water. Also, it's called the Dutch Dialogues. David Wagner, a very creative, very articulate architect, and a team that is quite remarkable. If you Google the Dutch Dialogues, you'll see much about their work. And here's what the theme of it is. The drawdown of the pumps is this. This multiple lines of defense was created by one of our directors of the Pontchartrain Basin Foundation. And it means that you have all these different things that will help us to mitigate storm surges and flooding. Now what Wagner has added to that is you could also have these as well. You can have ponds and lakes, you can have swales and permeability, and of course ultimately evacuation routes. But he's focused on this. What can you do to this sinking, sagging peat to get it back up, to fill it, to Botox it? How about that? Let's use that word. Put something in it, you know, liquid, so that it comes back up to where it should be. So here's what he diagrams and proposes. You open the levees, the flood walls, excuse me, on these two primary, 17th Street Canal is here, for example. You let the water flow through Bayou St. John all the way up here, and then you have all these swales, catchment ponds, anything you can do in an empty lot that will absorb the water with a heavy rainfall, that will not require that it go immediately into those pumps in the pumping stations. And then you think about it in economic development terms, because these walkable, beautiful canals will then be places where people can construct their homes, have recreational areas, have retail activities, and this is how he's depicting the London Avenue Canal. He even sees that this water when it fills this area, will backflow into these pipes and go back into the soil. So where these might be draining to a certain point, once the water, the rainstorm is stopped, for example, or the hurricane, then the water would flow back into the peat and bolster it again, the Botox idea. So here's the challenge that we have. And let me finish. Let me say one more thing about this. So this is the start of some new thinking. Now, I'm one who's been working on hurricane flooding and the fact that levees cause rather than prevent flooding for most of my life. I'm a Gilbert White student, if you know who he is. But this is today. They're actually starting to break the curve of thinking about how do we do something different than these growth machines have been doing historically. I see this as a growth machine because they're picking up momentum with the teams they bring, with an international perspective, but hopefully it will be to do this instead of to harm the ecosystem more. Okay, so we have this huge challenge. How to induce comprehensive technology impact assessment when economic development involves ecosystems. That's our challenge. Bill Freudenberg proposed long-term bonding of risky development. So that would have made the developers, the realtor from New York City, he would have had to bond New Orleans East before he built it. And a long-term bond. Do you think he ever would have built it if he had been required to do that? Likely not. And he probably should not have, so it would have stopped him. Another idea would be to do prepaid flood insurance by developers. Same thing, it's like a bonding, but it's flood insurance. Right now there are areas of coastal Louisiana, I just read this yesterday, $25,000 for a flood insurance for a house per year. That house should never have been placed there. And that owner can in no way, shape, or form afford $25,000. And I would add this third point. I've been working with systems engineers on a proposal for mitigating the BP oil spill and become a student of systems engineering. Again, a modest beginner student. But if we did a systems engineering approach to imagining the impacts that a development would have and brought into the conversation all of the stakeholders. When Boeing uses systems engineering to build a new plane, it has a myriad of stakeholders from the parts department in the company to the production department to the pilots to the airports. All of those are considered stakeholders. And if we could require, when these projects are started, that we have to, by law, have to have all the stakeholders at the table and the technical stakeholders who know about things such as the obsolescence of technology and the impact that cannot be mitigated, we might have a slight chance to mitigate what is just almost a plague, I guess I could call it, of these kinds of economic development projects. So instead, my specialty in this domain is mitigation, which is doing things that reduce risk other than levees. But unfortunately, some of the methods that we've been thinking about harm the environment. For example, National Flood Insurance Program harms the environment because it permits developers to develop areas that should not be developed because the purchasers will know that they can buy flood insurance to mitigate the risk that they're taking. But they don't know they're taking risk. You see a brand new slab-on-grade subdivision go into an area next to one of our swamps down here, and you think, oh, how lovely. It's just got this lovely waterway passing behind it, you know, and oh, you can't really see the levee because it's not very much there, you know. And then whammo, you get hit, and all of a sudden the actuarial rates of your flood insurance go up to $25,000. And also, other alternatives have been only minimally developed by the federal government, and I would use the polite word of awkwardly, meaning that they really don't have the systems there. I took this picture last Friday across the street from the University of New Orleans. This is a house that was raised by the funding that we got post-Katrina. Okay? Now, what more do we need is a visual of how a program, a federal program, can be done correctly. It will probably stand there until somebody decides that they're going to have to tear the house down, the building down. Contractor got money to elevate. This building is now, in terms of elevation, up to code. It's above the base flood elevation of 3 feet. You can see the dormitories on the left-hand side of the picture. That's what students and staff and faculty have to see every day as they leave the campus. Now, somewhat near the university is this street, which is what we would like to see. This is a contagion of homeowners who started to elevate, and then they shared their contractors with the neighbors across the street, and now we have a safe street. But much of what's been done with federal money has not achieved the goals and has not been managed adequately. These two houses here are still slab on grade, and what I love about this picture is there are for sale signs out in front of them. That's how it should be. Those houses should not be in commerce, as they would say. But we're nowhere near having mitigation options that would be less harmful to the ecosystem while still providing human habitation in appropriate ways for our culture. So to finish up just a little bit here, let's talk about the California Delta if you think that this is just a Louisiana way of doing things. And I know that's often culturally believed that we bring this on ourselves. Well, those of you who know California, bringing it on themselves with the California Delta. I'm going to say this in not quite technical terms. I have been here and I've seen all this, but I don't study it. This was Bill Freudenberg's specialty. Here's Sacramento, right, I think in here. And we were given, this is the flood-proofing conference that I attended. We were bused into this area. And we were taken up here to be shown that the new levee that's being built, instead of being built about here to protect the existing houses, is going to be built up here. And it's going to engulf this farmland. How long do you expect that farmland is going to be farmland? Okay? It's going to be developed because here are the ads. Here's what the Delta looks like. Okay? So we had a meeting with the Corps and we said, sir, why are you putting it above the farmland and not just around the existing structures? And the answer was, we needed a benefit-cost ratio of 1 or greater. So if you think that quote at the beginning of my presentation was too sarcastic, you can see how we come to impact the ecosystem in ways that are dreadful. So here's what their levees look like. You see the, oops, I'm sorry. Okay, you see the, this is inside the levee and this is outside of the levee. Okay, so that's the drop that has happened. So when this burst in one of the river floods, one of the events, it's all going to come out here and do the same thing that's happened here in Louisiana. Just a quick story on this building. It's a nice, spanking new fire department, firehouse. We were taken here to see it because all the important parts of this are on the second floor. And the reason it exists is because the California Delta levees were deauthorized because they were not performing at the level that the Corps requires. And so for this firehouse to stay in place, they had to build a new one, which was as it should be, with everything above the expected level of flooding if the levees broke. So we're in there and we're getting the tour and we're talking to the firefighters and we're all excited. And then the captain of the firehouse says, and just as soon as they authorize those levees, we're going to take everything from the second floor and put it back on the first. Well, this was a busload of mitigation specialists. I can't tell you how forlorn we were. We just turned around and got back on the bus. I mean, there's nothing you can say to somebody at that point. We were stunned. He had no sense that he had a safe firehouse, and when he did that, as soon as the levees broke, he would have an unsafe, flooded facility. So let's turn, to finish this, to the tri-state area after Sandy. There's a friend of mine at Tulane University whose name is Kevin Gotham, an excellent political economist. This work that I'm describing for you, in our sociological jargon, we call political economy, even though it's done by sociologists. And he has a book that's in press, they're just in production, called The Crisis Cities, Disaster and Redevelopment in New York and New Orleans. And it shows what happened after 9/11 in terms of the way that Manhattan was redeveloped. And the growth machine is the term that should be used to show you how forcefully certain developers got their way in terms of what they wanted. For example, the World Trade Center didn't need to be rebuilt because there wasn't enough demand for that office space after it crashed. But the growth machine insisted that it be built. And because of that, and because of what was developed in the Battery in the area below it, if you look at the line at the bottom of my slide, the outcome of that effort will be linked to impacts on the ecosystem because the Battery, the World Trade Center, and all that area will have to be protected. And there it is right there. Because of the growth that happened after 9/11, now we have to be thinking about levees, walls, all the things that you've seen, all the technology that you've seen in the media as to how we might protect this area. If instead there had been a slower redevelopment after 9/11 and it had been more in this part of the island, we wouldn't be necessarily asking the same questions about how to protect this. So the legacy of the 9/11 growth machine will be that there will be a demand for protection that will be costly and can ultimately impact the ecosystem, just like the projects that we have had here in New Orleans. So I know that might give you indigestion. It's not the cheeriest of lunchtime talks, but we have to learn something from what we all have gone through here. And I hope that framing it this way and putting it together will give you some food for thought, something to think about. And I thank you for your attention and your patience with my presentation.
Yes. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm over here to your...
Okay, I can't see anything.
I know. I'm here, believe me.
Okay.
I'm not just a disembodied voice from the heavens.
There's 4 lights behind you.
All right. Thank you very much for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. What was running in my mind as you were going through your material was that what seems to underlie a lot of this ultimately is the desire that many in our culture have to get a college degree, buy a house, live in a nice neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And that, I don't know, it's sort of a cliche, but it seems like that's where all this weight to, to protect so that we can develop, so that we can enhance commerce, seems like that's where it all comes from. And that's pretty fundamental in our culture and very difficult to deal with in the context.
It's the normal, right? It's the normal that I said initially.
Right.
It's normal.
So what do you think? I mean, how do we address that? That is so fundamental and primal in, I suspect, in even those of us who are highly concerned and very sympathetic to your argument. Where do we start?
Well, there are subdivisions, and then there are subdivisions. And there's also density, and there's also the reuse of urban areas that can be made more dense and attractive, and it's called the new urbanism that to me provides many more amenities than the sprawl that you see where people have to commute for long distances. So we rethink what quality of life means in terms of human habitation. And we start, children these days are getting more aware of environmental issues. You'll see them recycling, you'll see them telling their parents what to do with regard to green issues because they're learning them in schools. We could do the same thing with a lot of issues with regard to how settlements should be constructed and how they can be beneficial to human uses and still not harmful to the environment. But we haven't even started to approach that because the force of the American dream of the suburb is so powerful. I mean, I could even say strongly to you that the suburb is going to be the death knell of our society because it requires us to continue doing fossil fuels because of the commute that it takes and the cars that, that we have to use. So it's pretty serious, and it's just, as you said, just normal. That's what makes it so deadly. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it.